Hello, I'm Alec, and this is Idle Musings. Today's topic is the Olympics. Now, the Olympics are a great time to watch and experience sports that we don't normally see. For example, I particularly enjoy watching the team handball tournament, which is not a sport that's really popular in the United States, and often when people hear about it, they say, oh, what is that? And if you've ever watched it, it involves a lot of weird jumping around over these weird colored areas on a court that kind of looks like a basketball court, and people kind of throwing balls at each other. It's unclear if you aren't really sure what the sport actually is. But there are other sports too, swimming, track and field, gymnastics, that are much more popular in the United States, that practically everyone watches when the Olympics are on, but when the Olympics are over, no one cares about again. Even with basketball, which of course people like throughout the year and have their own favorite college teams or professional teams, during the Olympics is very different. You have teams representing countries rather than teams representing cities or brands or colleges. And so you get a much more national game where Americans are much more proud of the fact that they are American and America is so good at basketball, which we practically invented, yada, yada, yada. This is an experience you don't really get to have the rest of the year. But there is one sport that I'd like to talk about where it's kind of more unpopular during the Olympics than you might expect. And that sport is men's soccer. Now, men's soccer is the most popular sport in the world by many metrics. It's watched and played throughout the populated world, even in the United States, which has historically been a kind of less popular place for soccer, is seeing a kind of burgeoning interest in the sport, especially after World Cups, especially after the 1994 World Cup, which we hosted and had the most well-attended World Cup ever. In this sport, we see great American athletes like Clint Dempsey or Jermaine Jones playing for American teams in Major League Soccer and increasing the popularity of the sport at home, which is pretty great. And in much of the world, like Europe or South America, it is definitely the most popular sport around. So then the question is, why don't we really care about Olympic men's soccer? And why don't Europeans really care about Olympic men's soccer? Because they don't. And if you look at the teams that have won the World Cup versus the teams that have won the men's Olympic soccer tournament, you see very different groups of people. For example, Brazil, which won their first Olympic tournament this year in Rio when they were hosting, has won the World Cup on 5 separate occasions. Moreover, Germany, which has won the World Cup 4 different times, only won the Olympic tournament once. And some African nations like Cameroon or Nigeria have never won the World Cup or even really come close, to be honest. They've won the Olympic tournament several times. So what can account for this? Why is the interest level so different? And why are the teams that are winning so different? Well, there are a couple different reasons for this. The first is that soccer is a bit of a victim of its own success, and we see a similar effect in other sports where there are regular international meetings between some of the top teams. In tennis, for example, the sport's biggest names are often meeting during regular tour events or during the 4 Grand Slam events, the US Open, the Australian Open, French Open, and Wimbledon. So when they come together for the Olympics, it's just not as special because we've seen these players again and again come against each other in the court. And while it's great to see them again, it's not exactly special. You get to see Usain Bolt racing at his biggest stage. And we see this also in golf, where it's a kind of new sport at the Olympics, but people in the golf community just don't care about Olympic golf as much as they care about the 4 majors, the Masters, the US Open, the British Open, and the PGA Championship. In soccer, we have, of course, the World Cup, which is every 4 years, but there's also regional tournaments between nations like the Euros or the Copa America, where some of the really big international teams play each other again. And there are also a smattering of international friendlies where these teams just decide to play each other, and it's very good for the fans, but it would make this Olympic tournament less interesting in that it's no longer new or novel in quite the same way that swimming or gymnastics is. So that's the first reason. But there's a different reason, a reason that's a little bit more heinous, and it has to do with history. So, soccer first started in the Olympics in 1900 in Paris. At that time, Olympic soccer was very different from the kind of tournament we have today. The biggest difference was that it were club teams that were competing rather than national teams. And if you look at, for example, the record book, you'll find that the winner of the 1904 Olympic tournament in St. Louis was, quote, Canada. And then the silver and bronze medals were both won by American teams. So what happened? Well, there were multiple teams from the same countries that competed in the 1904 Olympics, and the 1904 Olympics is kind of a weird case where a bunch of people didn't really want to go out to the middle of nowhere, St. Louis, and compete, so you had a bunch of mostly American teams competing against each other, and as a result, in even some of the team events, America won multiple medals, including soccer. But there were 2 American teams, and one happened to finish in second, and one happened to finish in third, and a team that happened to be from Canada happened to win gold. And so today we attribute that medal to Canada, and then 2 medals to the United States. But at the time, they would have attributed the medal to the club team from Canada that happened to win, and then the silver medal would have gone to the American team that happened to win. So this is a very different tournament. The first real Olympic soccer tournament happens in around 1908, when we have countries competing against each other for the first time. By 1924, Uruguay and Argentina joined, which meant for the first time there were South American teams also competing in the Olympic tournament. This was a huge step up for the game, as it meant that some of the best teams from all around the world were competing. And indeed, in 1924 and 1928, Uruguay would win the Olympic tournament. Now, these two Uruguayan victories ended up convincing FIFA, the international governing board for soccer, to hold their own tournament, the World Cup, where they would invite all the best countries from around the world outside the Olympic setting. First one happened in 1930 in Uruguay, and then it's gone on roughly every 4 years since, with a few breaks for world wars. Now, this is kind of an interesting story, and indeed, to this day, every international team wears a number of stars above its crest equal to the number of World Cup victories it's had. For example, Italy and Germany have each won 4 World Cups apiece, so each wears 4 stars above their crest. Now, the exception is Uruguay. Uruguay has only won the World Cup twice, but they wear 4 stars. Why? Their 2 Olympic victories, as well as their 2 World Cup victories, so 1924 and 1928 Olympics, and their 2 World Cup victories. Now, this is a reminder from FIFA that these 2 Olympics were really instrumental in creating the modern international soccer field that we have today, and in creating the desire to have the World Cup, so it's a very important historical event. So Uruguay gets to remember those, as well as their World Cups, which I think is pretty fitting. Then the real question is, after the 1928 Olympics and after the 1930 World Cup, why didn't the Olympics remain to be an interesting event? Well, the main reason is that for a while the IOC mandated that all athletes at the Olympics be amateurs. That meant that no one who was making money playing the sport was allowed to compete in the Olympics, more or less. Now, in soccer, there was an increasing professionalization of the sport, which meant that more and more the top players were going pro, making money, and therefore depleting talent from the Olympic pool, which meant that the Olympic tournament just wasn't as interesting to watch as the World Cup, or the regular international friendlies, or even club soccer. However, in 1984, the IOC relaxed its rules and has allowed professional athletes to compete in the Olympics ever since, which is why you see professional tennis players playing the tennis tournament, professional swimmers swimming in the swimming events, etc. But why has the Olympic soccer tournament continued to be lackluster? Well, the answer is that FIFA has decided to try and protect its own World Cup by imposing restriction on team rosters during the men's Olympic tournament. Now, the rules have changed over the years since it was introduced in 1984, but the current rules are that no team is allowed to have more than 3 players on its rosters who are over 23. That means that the men's Olympic soccer tournament is essentially a U23 tournament, a youth tournament, and while there are youth World Cups and some people watch them, they're just not as big a draw as the real tournaments, the real World Cup, etc. There it is. There are 2 main reasons why the Olympic men's soccer tournament just might not be as interesting as we hope it would be. 1, it's not as special because men's soccer has a smattering of international events that make sure that the best players are competing against each other regularly, even outside the context of the Olympics. And secondly, FIFA's decision to limit the goodness of the people who can play means that the soccer played isn't as compelling or as high stakes as the soccer that is played during, for example, the World Cup. Oh, and by the way, none of this applies to the women's tournament. FIFA does not restrict the rosters of the women's tournament, so you have the best women's players playing in those teams. In addition, the kind of smaller field of the Olympic tournament means there's a more intimate feel than during the World Cup where there are more teams competing, and it also means that a higher proportion of the matches feature really good teams. So, if you want to see good Olympic soccer, the women's tournament is without a doubt the tournament to watch.